to be here back in the HCI seminar in this building with so many friends, former colleagues, perhaps future colleagues, and future friends. This is a fairly new talk, some hot off the press results that I'm still kind of emailing back and forth with my student about, so be patient and ask me questions, probably at the end. Just for credits, this is mostly work led by my PhD student Maurice at Cornell Tech with some other great collaborators, including Shao and including some faculty here, even like Jeff Hancock. And Michael mentioned Google, but just a disclaimer, this is a Cornell talk. I'm wearing my Cornell hat, not physically, but metaphorically. Not about Google. I don't represent Google in any way here. All right, good. Trust. Let me try this again in a more John Oliver way. Trust. That was my best British accent. Trust is why we can go 5,000 miles and stay with someone we have never met before in their house. Trust is also why you can leave food in the Gates refrigerator and hope that it's not taken away and eaten by somebody else. Trust is why you can book speakers, inviting hundreds of people to see them and know that they show up for the talk. And trust is also why we can eat at restaurants. Some of the faculty might remember this, and the students, I don't know, Seinfeld. So trust is often defined as the willingness to take risk, make ourselves vulnerable to others with the expectation of getting some future reward. Trust is fundamental to almost everything we do every day, our interactions, our transactions, our relationships, but not only those. Trust is also important for our society and our economy to function. We trust various institutions and organizations, and we do that every day in Western societies more often, more likely than others, in multiple ways than others. We trust our government to mostly act in our best interest. We trust corporations, for example, banks with our money, or let's say search engine companies. We trust the media to reflect to us how our society is functioning or not. We'll come back to the media in a second. Altogether, the trust relationships are fundamental to the stability of our society and our democracy. But how we trust each other has also shifted. So our social structures and interactions shifted from the interpersonal face-to-face communities to social and online medias, where our trust, our information consumptions, our interactions, our trust decisions are informed, governed, and are sometimes increasingly supported by technology and AI. So the decision to trust have moved to be online, and our interactions have moved online as well. So what happens to trust in these settings has been the topic of research that my group has been looking at the last few years. So what happens is a new information ecosystem where our interactions are supported by algorithms and AI and not in face-to-face setting. And notice that I'm talking about not trust in technology, but trust, how we trust each other through technology, which is a slightly different topic. So here's the outline for this talk. One thread of the talk will be looking at trust in media. And we're going to look at how, I'm going to describe an online experiment on how trust in media is impacted by our partisan evaluations of both sources and headline content. This is one experiment. The other thread looks at trust in interpersonal settings. And I'm going to introduce a new topic, a new concept that we call AI-mediated communication, which kind of represents the fact that a lot of our communication now are not necessarily transmitted by computers, but also optimized in some way or generated by algorithms and machines to get some kind of outcome. And we'll look at an online experiment that talks about trust and investigates what happens to trust in those settings. So these are two online experiments, and at the end I'm going to talk about a few ways that we can think about this problem as HCI researchers. I'm not going to talk about today other work at the lab. As Michael mentioned, we do various different kinds of work, not just online experiments. For example, recent tools to support journalists in battling visual misinformation. It's more like an HCI systems project. We have a project on looking at misinformation targeted at political candidates and so forth. But today, mostly online experiment work. So trust in media. I already started the motivation, but just to expand a little bit specifically on media, our information, the basis of our reality, our political reality, our social reality, is based a lot on our media consumption. And that media consumption is increasingly served via algorithmically curated feeds, whether it's recommendation systems, whether it's news feeds like Facebook and others. And interesting question, what happens to trust in the media organization and the information that they serve in those settings? Trust in media and journalism is the foundation of democracy, and the purpose of journalism is to make us informed so we can be free and self-governing. So this is an important area to study. At the same time, we also know that media is increasingly under attack, if you've been following the news, increasingly seen as partisan and manipulated in various ways with consequences. We know that Americans currently do not trust the media. They have very low levels of trust, increasingly observed. This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. And we also know that it's very partisan, right? People trust the media sources that align with their views and distrust the others. So this partisanship was one of the key things that we wanted to focus on to see how people evaluate it in online settings. And in particular, we wanted to ask how the evaluation of the news headlines that we encountered in our feeds might be impacted by how we align ourselves with the source versus how we align ourselves with what they report. So to give an example, if you're conservative and maybe you have a preference for Fox News, and you see a Fox News headline that said that the majority of Americans now support the impeachment process, are you going to say, get out of here, I don't believe that, because you have some kind of bias towards accepting that kind of news? Or are you going to believe Fox News because they align with your view and say if Fox News reports that, that must be correct, compared to the same headline, for example, served by the New York Times? So you already probably guessed that there are a few factors that may impact this evaluation. One of them is source credibility. So how much I trust the source, how much I trust their expertise, how much they aligned with my goals and my views will impact how I trust the information they report. Another factor, of course, is motivated reasoning, right? The idea, sometimes called directionally motivated reasoning, that seeks us to look for information that reinforces our existing views. Confirmation bias is one of the mechanisms that is involved with motivated reasoning. And that means that people accept things that align with the view and tend to reject new information that does not align with their worldviews and experiences. And finally, another thing that can happen, especially when you're doing online experiment, to ask people about their views, is what is called expressive or sometimes motivated responding. The idea there is that when an individual is presented with information that is against their worldview, they might know the right answer, but still be expressive and report the wrong answer to you, to the experimenter. So this happened famously when Republicans were asked about inauguration photos. So they were shown side by side, clearly labeled photos from the Obama and Trump inauguration. If you've seen those, you know that Obama's was clearly better attended, and yet the Republican responded in higher numbers tended to say that Trump's was better attended. Okay, so now we can ask a little bit more detailed research question, which is how would the evaluation of news change in the response to the different sources and the different media sources, and in particular, what is the relative impact of how you trust the source versus how you align yourself with the headline. And the second part that I'm not going to talk about is whether we can actually find evidence that people are doing this expressive responding when we do this study. So the way we did that is an online experiment, as I mentioned. In the experiment, we randomly assigned headlines and claims that we chose specifically for the study, and sources that we chose. Both of them had leaning right or left. And I'll show you how we did it in a second. In fact, this is the most important, the one method slide that you should pay attention to. We took a bunch of headlines, and sometimes we showed a left-leaning headline from a left-leaning source, like the New York Times. Sometimes we showed that same headline as if it was coming from a right-leaning source, and the opposite, right? We took a right-leaning headline, and sometimes we showed that with a left-leaning source, and sometimes with a right-leaning source. Okay, that was the basic setup. Actually, I'm going to show you one more slide that you need to pay attention to, and then a bunch of other more detailed information. We basically, for every one of those headlines, we asked people if they think the claim in the headline was true or false. You can ask me later a lot of details of how we selected this question and whether or not we wanted a scale or just true or false, but we ended up with this for this study. Yep.
Were all the headlines real headlines?
Yeah, great. I'll talk about the headline selection in a second. The answer is yes, for the experiment, yes. They were all things that we evaluated as true, whatever that means. So here's how we selected the claims in particular. We wanted claims that are representative of what people might encounter in their everyday news consumption. We wanted things that were factual, that people can actually say, somebody can actually say whether they're true or not true. We wanted things that were partisan, that either supported US liberal or conservative views. And we wanted things that are not easily marked as true, right? So it's not Trump is the president of the United States, but things that are a little harder to guess for any person. I don't have time to go all the details of how we did this. If you're a quick reader, you can get an idea. But just to say that that is Maurice, the graduate student, went through a long process of data collection and annotation, at the end of which we had 10 headlines that we evaluated as right-leaning and 10 that we evaluated as left-leaning, or we, based on our evaluation, were right and left-leaning, with claims that we evaluated as true, but also verified that were hard to know whether they're true or not by people on Mechanical Turk. So, and these are the two examples like you've seen before. For sources, we wanted to have sources that are widely recognized media organizations. And notice when I say media, not necessarily journalistic organizations, and you'll see in a second. And we also wanted sources that are perceived by the public as leaning one way and biased in some way, partisan or other. Yes, we made sure that we got ones that, based on previous studies, were kind of, well, if it had to be recognizable enough, we couldn't go to the really far end of the bias. But as you can see, we show things that are quite seen differently.
There's these other scales where they've like tried to show how far from the center.
Yeah.
So you try to balance.
Yeah, we try to go as far as we can, but make sure that we have things that are recognizable, so it doesn't leave us with a lot of choice. After we cover these 6, so we're hard to justify adding anyone else to this list. So CNN, HuffPost, the New York Times versus Fox News, the Drudge Report, and Breitbart are kind of seen as opposite scales by the public and are widely recognized by many.
But wouldn't something like Breitbart or the Drudge Report be pretty far to the right compared to, let's say, CNN and the New York Times to be to the left, but not as extreme?
That's based on the studies that were done. They're fairly equivalent. They're not seen as they're equivalent how they seem to others on the right and the left. So they're not that far off in terms of bias perception. And I'm not. This is not a qualitative comment about how biased they are or not, but
where they show the distance and
yeah.
it seemed different.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there was no perfect choice. There may have been a little differences between them and how they lean, but and we also have, I don't have it here today, but we have an analysis of pair one of these sources. I'm going to aggregate this, but we can talk later about how they actually differed between them. So here's how the experiment was set up. As I mentioned, we had 20 claims, left-leaning in blue and right-leaning in red. For each participant that came into the online experiment, we matched a random liberal claim with a liberal source, like I described before, and then did a right-leaning claim with a right-leaning source, and then we mixed it up. So each of them saw 4 of these headlines that we asked, and then whether they thought it was true or not. Now, if we just did these 4, the purpose of the experiment would have been pretty obvious. So we also mixed it up. To hide the true aim of the study, we also showed them 12 other headlines. I'm not going to talk about how they're selected. I'm just going to mention that 2 of them, the black ones, were actual fake news things. So that as they go through the headlines and mark things that are true or false, they'll find things that were pretty clearly false, right? So they didn't have to force themselves to mark things as false otherwise. We also asked them about their political leanings, and we used various measures to do that. For example, who they voted for, who they identify with, who they would have voted for, and others. The analysis results are pretty much the same for each of these measures. We asked them about trust recognition of the media sources that we used and others, and also we got some demographic information, although that was very limited given that we used Mechanical Turk. The spread there was not that great. Okay, so we launched the study on Mechanical Turk, got a lot of people to rate our headlines, and let's look at some of the results. Actually, before we look at them, let's see what people think might have more impact. Was it the source? Do people believe the source that align with their views? So if it's conservative and Fox News, they'll believe anything that they say? Or was it the headlines, the headline claims where they aligned with the claim? It didn't matter who reported it, and they thought it was true. So who thinks the source had more impact? And who thinks the headline alignment had more impact? All right, let's see what happened. You can change your mind, Manish. It's okay.
So, what did you ask them to do? Just say if it was true or false, or anything else?
Just say if it was true or false. And then we can see for each, what we did is aggregate, we'll show in a second, we aggregated for each source, or for each, in fact, for each leaning of each match of source leaning and person leaning. We could see how many times they agreed with that.
But there's a difference between whether it's true or false and whether it's biased in one direction.
That's right. Yeah, this is the second, right, we'll see the effect of bias, but we're not going to measure, directly ask about the bias. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the connection between the true or false selection that people were asked to make with how you're reading the trust question?
Yeah, so...
Drawing a conclusion about who's trusting whom from the true or false selection itself. That's
right. So I'm going to say that this is a measure of trust, right, especially in the sources. So we'll see if that's what's happening here. So this is what happens with the... this is the source effect. So when we see here, at the top, for example, these are all the left-leaning participants, and how much they trusted the 2 dots, or how much they, on average, trusted, how many times they saw a claim that was from the source is left-leaning, right? And the blue point says how much time the participants on the right and on the left chose to believe headlines that were associated with the left-leaning source, right? So, for example, the right blue dot on the top line is 56% of the time were a left-leaning participant. So a headline coming from a left-leaning source, they marked it as true, right? And you can see that there's only a little bit of difference here between the participant on the right and on the left, where the right-leaning participant believed the left-leaning sources 53% of the time.
This is based only on the 4.
That's right, the 4 experimental.
That you did, not the 12 control.
That's right. Only the 4 experimental readings we got from each participant. Data points. Yeah.
Did you give them a baseline of what proportion of them are true?
We did not give them a baseline. That's why we gave them the two clearly false things. So we didn't want to say anything about what proportion of them are false or true.
But that's all but the two were true?
Yes.
So,
this is
so
low.
if they were accurate, that it would be something like, and you didn't say how many things they rated, but it would be like up in the 80s or 90s would be.
There would be 100 because they rated, we're only looking at the 4 things that we validated as true, and that's the only thing that we're showing here. So if they were accurate, it would be 4 all the way to the end. So, yep.
What was the order in which you showed these?
Random order.
Random order.
Yeah,
Because they could have seen the fake news articles, the very first, and that could have biased their view of the next ones as well.
It could be, but I don't know which way would it bias.
You do a random ordering, so it would be negated out.
Yeah. So you can see for the right-leaning source here, there's a slightly different effect where the right-leaning participants believed it 56% of the time, right? So when something came from a right-leaning source, and only 47% of the time where left-leaning participants saw that. They believed those headlines. So there was some effect of source, and you'll notice, and I'll come back to it at the end, that effect was mostly generated by the left-leaning participants that shifted the most. The right-leaning participant did not almost shift to the response to source at all.
What are the numbers on the right?
Just the delta. Yeah, I don't know why it says 2, but maybe the rounding error. The effect of the claim was a lot more dramatic, and at least you'll notice that, again, you'll notice that this was mostly for the left-leaning participants, and I'll come back to that again. So the left-leaning participant, when they saw a claim that aligned with their views, they believed it a lot more, and when they saw a claim that was not, they believed it a lot less. The right-leaning participant did not have a similar shift. So there was a regression. Again, I said I was still, this is initial analysis. We're still analyzing some of the data, but we could run a regression to predict the true or false results, and can see that 7% are, if you have an aligned source, you're 7% more likely to think something is true. But in particular, if you have a claim that's aligned with you, you're 15% more likely to believe that claim.
This is not an interaction effect. Like what you were showing was a classic interaction.
Yeah. Right. So definitely. So we need. I don't have all the results yet because we want to make sure we do it properly. There were interactions. In fact, the interactions were also dependent on the source because not all the sources were treated the same way. So the Drudge report, as you can imagine, was a little different than Fox News in key ways. So I don't have the full results yet, and probably need to collect more data. But this trend has been very similar. We now ran this experiment or a similar one about 3 times with very similar results every single time, regardless of the news sources we use, regardless of the claims, very similar outcomes.
I'm not saying, sorry, I'm not trying to say that the interaction effect negates what you're seeing, just that it seems like it is an interaction, right? It seems like the right-leaning people attended to the claim and the left-leaning people attended to the source. Is that what it is?
No, I don't think I don't know that we're seeing, we haven't seen that in the other studies that we ran, so I don't think that that's what's happening.
I see. Could you go back a slide? Just maybe I misinterpreted. So left-leaning, right-leaning on the left, is that the source or the person?
That is the, here it's the claim, right?
Okay.
So the participant are the dots. And so when you see a left-leaning claim, this is how the participant reacts.
I see. Okay.
When you see a right-leaning claim, that's
perhaps.
But there was definitely a difference in how they reacted, but not that. So I think we have, from the studies that we've done, the multiple studies, and this one that I just presented, there's a strong evidence for motivated reasoning, and that the claim is a lot stronger when you see something in your feed, even if you align with the source. The claim review will be a stronger force in this evaluation. The second thing is the surprising asymmetry that we found between the left and right leaning. And again, it wasn't as strong in the other studies that we've done, and I'm not showing you today, but there was always a stronger reaction from the left-leaning participants and from the right-leaning ones that I don't know if I can explain, but a couple of reasons for that may be one is the type of sources that we picked for the experiments, and two, the fact that we have a mostly right-leaning government right now, which might cause different types of responses with different participants. But that's something that we plan to investigate further. I didn't discuss the expressive responding part, where people know the right answer, but say what they really want to be true. We have some evidence that that's happening, but it's inconclusive, I would say, at this point. So the next thing we want to do is, yeah.
What if there's an interaction between the claim and the news source itself, where I might trust a claim that doesn't align with how that news source leans more, because I would not expect that news source to.
Yeah, so the informativeness, right, of this, but we didn't see a lot of effect beyond the main effects that we saw.
Like a technique of things like InfoWars, that you have to have some stuff known to be true to get people to believe the stuff that's kind of purposely fake.
Yeah, well, so we haven't evaluated that. So the idea, right, so this is something that appears on the feed, so you don't necessarily go to the InfoWars website and consume everything that they have, so there's no reputation effect there, but it could be an interesting other question. Yeah.
Another higher level question. Thinking about the ecological validity of this study, you really primed people to be thinking about the veracity of the articles that they're looking at. Like everything, it's like, is this one true? Is this one true? Is this one true? And I'm wondering if that were not as primed or as salient, what the effects would be, right? Do you think it? Like my assumption is that would be far weaker if I weren't like trying to sniff out fake news from true news.
Right.
And I'm just sort of like going through my daily media habit and scrolling through stuff I read. Maybe it wouldn't even register.
Yeah, in fact, the ecological validity, I think there's the more perhaps significant threat to ecological validity is the fact that most of these newspapers will report headlines that are aligned, or at least report claims in a way that is aligned with their views. Right. So when Fox News, for example, did post the 51% of Americans support the impeachment process, it was a big deal. People said, "I can't believe Fox News did that." So it doesn't happen often. And then you might ask, so what does this mean for how people really evaluate? So, and another is, are they really strongly? In fact, in the second study I'll show in a different area, we're going to talk about the mechanisms that do trigger this evaluation, right, and thought, and how would they impact the results. So that definitely can happen as well. So we specifically wanted to put people in that situation so we can evaluate the effect of source versus headline claim alignment. But the ecological validity is therefore, I think it can teach us something about how the evaluation works in the real world, but in a specific scenario where we put in cognitive effort and processing.
Yeah, in this case, Turkers are kind of a tough population because they're gonna, as soon as they click through the IRB, they're gonna be sniffing around for like what the manipulation is.
That's right. Yeah.
So I don't know how that would swing the results, but it seems like people would get sort of a little bit more attuned to what might be happening. Like,
we were imagining, and we asked them debrief questions to see if they were correctly sniffing it, and that's what a lot of decoys. The decoys were there for that purpose. So I think they thought it was a fake news study, which is fine. I mean, that's literally what we asked them to do.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we added the two actual fake news.
Yeah.
And we could see also for the two actual fake news headlines that we included, most people got them as false. Yeah.
So I'm a bit surprised at how low the numbers are in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
Because all the headlines were true.
Yeah.
Right? And so it made me wonder if they were actually answering a different question.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they believe that the source and the headline are a match. Right. Like, could they
from the data, quick answer from the data, it didn't look like that was the case, but it's a good concern.
It's weird that the numbers are so
The numbers
low.
are low.
Yeah.
And they were consistently low in every single version of that experiment that we ran. Very similar overall scale.
Is it, just one way to look at that would be, is it higher when you have it aligned, right? When New York Times is reporting something liberal,
Yeah. So that's really, it's a New York Times reporting something liberal, evaluated by liberals or conservatives, right? We didn't quite have enough data in this study to do this level of analysis, but it's an interesting, I think, question that we want to do. Last question for now, but then, yeah.
It seems like there are different conversations about trust, what it is, in terms of a driver of behavior. Were there any other assumptions you were trying to make on what trust allows people to do, like selection of a story before you read them?
Yeah.
Or determining whether a fact is a fact or not after you've read the story? In your case, it seems like you're asking people to say whether they believe the source saying this is true or false, whether this actually happened or not. It seems like that is your metric for going backwards into trust.
Yeah.
Did you have any other considerations for how you will determine trust other than this true-false thing?
No, in fact, we wanted to kind of factor away everything else because we thought that this is how people encounter most of the information. So, we didn't talk about, how you select your exposure, how you moderate it, how you evaluate, anything like that was kind of factored out mostly. So that's a, very narrow trust question we're asking here. Let me just quickly say there are other things that you can ask about. For example, what kind of signals they see on the news article in terms of previous interactions. So here we have an experiment where we told them that this piece of content was rated by people who were mostly democratic and they mostly thought it was true. And then we asked them how that changes or how they evaluate a claim based on that. This is common in some online feeds, but I'm not going to get into that today. In particular, I think it's interesting to continue to consider how this relates to the filter bubble, right? So the idea of the filter bubble that we can see the viewpoints of people who are different than us, but if you don't trust those viewpoints, right, you can put all the Fox News you want in my feed or all the headlines that counter my bias in my feed, but it will probably just cause a backfire effect. So how do we change that so we can trust the other side and what they're shared and the claims that we make is an interesting and important question. But let me move into the interpersonal trust aspect of the talk, and I'll try to do it more quickly. This is also a nice setup online experiment, and here we asked about how we trust each other. So not media organizations or the information they provide, but literally how we trust each other. And this was motivated by, as I mentioned before, what the trends that we see in computer-mediated communication. That was traditionally the idea of the sender composes some message and transmits it to the receiver, given the channel. So they craft the message to this channel, whether it's text or video or whatever that is. But the receiver evaluates it completely knowing that it was generated by the sender. With AI, increasingly, we have communication channels where the AI agent participates in the communication in an active way, suggests edits, modifications, perhaps generates the entire communication on our behalf. We have a paper with Jeff and Karen Levy at Cornell, where we call this AIMC. We talk about interpersonal communication that's increasingly optimized, augmented, and generated by algorithms to get specific outcomes from the receiver. Let me give you some examples of how this exists today. Everybody here uses Gmail, I'm guessing. And Gmail gives you now what they call smart replies. This is a response from me to my student dissertation proposal. I don't think I used that one in this case. LinkedIn will generate an automatic summary from your resume online. A more involved way, Google Duplex can have entire conversations on your behalf that will then project on how you are seen by that entity or business. And so just some current day examples. In the future, we may have AI that can make your face more trustworthy in online or offline settings. We can have AI depicting you. This is work from Berkeley, dancing like a pro or lifting weights that you can't otherwise do in world settings. So, or just simply optimize your message for maximum persuasion for each specific individual you're communicating with. So with this entire future of AI-MC, we asked a very simple question, which is how will people evaluate others differently if they know that AI is involved in particular in profile creation, so when we create online profiles. There are a number of theories that may predict that the outcome of such involvement. I'll go over this quickly. You have the pointers. It could be not changing at all because people will not mind it at all. It could be seen as more trustworthy when AI or computer generates your profile because there is the algorithmic heuristics of computers cannot lie or computers are good at producing correct information. And it could be less trustworthy, for example, because there is more uncertainty. There's something in the middle now between the human actually describing themselves and you reading that description. So concretely, we use the Airbnb as the research context, both because it's a kind of high-stake trust situation, but also because we had a lot of great data about trustworthiness of hosts from previous studies that were run in my lab by my student Xiao. And we asked participants here, or the question was, how will potential guests evaluate hosts differently if they think AI was involved in authoring the profile? Okay, just like I've shown before. So in this online experiment, we showed people text descriptions of Airbnb hosts, and we asked them to rate them for trustworthiness. And sometimes we had those profiles show as automatically generated by computers. We didn't, by the way, use the term AI in the study because it's kind of loaded socially, and people already have some negative interactions to it. So we said generated by computers, or whatever, something like that, that was more neutral, perhaps. In fact, we showed them, this is what we showed them that was happening. Kind of that was the deception in the study. We said, oh, people will put in the Facebook profiles and we get a generated profile. Everybody believed that manipulation, we're pretty sure. People think that AI is capable of doing this, or computers are capable of doing this. In reality, importantly, we used only profiles that were actually written by hosts. Okay. So here is the first experiment that we did. We took 10 profiles that were slightly different in how trustworthy they seem from previous studies. And we asked people in the control condition, we said these are all written Airbnb regular profiles. Please rate them for trustworthiness. And then in the treatment, we told them these were all written by AI. I think we had some cover story of we're developing a new system. Tell us what you think, how trustworthy the host is for this study. So the task was to evaluate the trustworthiness of the host. So we ran on Mechanical Turk, getting ratings. So here's the rating that we got for the control group. So this is regular human profiles. You can see that they varied in trustworthiness, pretty accurately matching what we expected, the high trustworthiness and low trustworthiness users. So here, every column is one of the hosts. And this is the average trustworthiness ratings, right? So the 5 ones on the left were more trusted than the 5 on the right. And then now we can see for the same profiles what happened when they were evaluated as AI-written profiles. Okay, who thinks they were trusted more when AI profiles were, now you're afraid of me. Who thinks AI profiles were trusted more than human profiles? The same profiles, when people thought they were written by AI, were trusted more. Who thinks they were trusted less? All right, good. Yeah, it caused a false selection because they were actually trusted the same. There was absolutely no difference. This is tracking very closely every single profile, the rating. But you know, we still have time in the talk, and I won't be showing you this today. If this was the only result that we had. So we had 2 other experiments, actually, I'm going to tell you about. The first one showed no effect. But we thought it may have been no effect because all the profiles were the same kind. And we said, we were wondering what happens if we mix them up in various ways. So now we will have a setup where we have profiles that are sometimes AI written and sometimes host written. Yeah.
What did you ask them? Like, did you ask them, do you trust this person?
No, it's a great question.
Did you ask them, do you think this is written by an AI?
No. Well, read the paper for details, but the main question was evaluating the trustworthiness of the host directly. So the benevolence, the integrity, there's a framework for Meyer that we use to ask about the trustworthiness. And we also asked how much they think it's AI. I'll come back to that later, but not in all the cases. I'll show it in a second. So in this experiment, for example, we took the same profiles, and we just showed an interface where we sometimes, when we told them some of those were written by hosts and some of those was written by AI. But I'm not going to tell you about experiment 2. I'm going to tell you about experiment 3, where we had 30 profiles that were pre-tested of how much people think they are written by AI or written by a host. So to do that, we had a pre-test where we took profiles that were kind of average trustworthiness, and we asked people if they think that this was written by a human or written by AI. Okay, so here's an example. Here's a profile that people mostly thought were written by AI. So, hello, I'm Sebastian, originally from Germany. And this was a profile that people usually thought was written by a human. Let me open with a huge hello to everyone reading this. Right, so it was very clear and very strong effect. I'll come back to this later of what people thought was AI or not. And again, reminder, everything here written by humans, right? No AI was hurt in the making of this research. So, okay, from this, for each participant, we chose 5 of each randomly, and then randomly shown them in random order. And we had a few conditions. And one of them, again, we told them these were all written by hosts. In the second one, we told them, again, this was mixed. So some of them were written by hosts, some by AI. And in the third, we actually labeled those that looked more like AI. We actually put a generated profile on them, and the other ones we put human or whatever. We didn't put any information. All right, so let's see what happened. So first of all, this is the condition where people thought all these profiles were human. As you can see, the profiles that we pre-labeled as looking like AI were actually more trustworthy in these settings. So, right, so now we have the profiles that we know look like AI if we ask people the question, but the participant thought these were all human, so they were rated as more trustworthy. This is what happened when we told them that the profiles are mixed. They can be either AI or human. But we didn't label them, so they didn't know which one is which. In this case, we actually saw that everything that we thought looked more like AI indeed suffered a drop in trustworthiness, and the humans did not. In fact, the humans may have had a little increase in that setting. So things that looked like humans, that we knew looked like humans, right? Remember, they were not labeled or anything. When we had a label condition, so now that these are the same profiles that look like AI or look like humans, that we actually labeled as computer-generated or not. And the computer-generated profiles got even more of a drop in trustworthiness compared to the humans. Interestingly, if we aggregate that in a different condition that I didn't explain, we actually ask people, we ask people how AI they think the profiles are, and we could see that the mere suspicion of that something was written by AI already caused a drop in the trustworthiness ratings. Pretty significant one too, until when they were pretty sure that something was AI generated, it was already leveled bottom of trustworthiness scores. So no effect on rating except when this information was mixed. So we had the consistently in both experiment 2 and the various condition of 3, that we saw that there were drop in trustworthiness for things that looked like AI. And you asked the question before, I think the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, can help explain this. This is also what happened in the previous study, perhaps, right? When we asked people to kind of to make that AI more salient, it caused them to think about this more, and therefore they shifted in their scores more when AI was brought to the front. That may have led them to participate in a more careful evaluation, right? So more salient evaluation, maybe a central route, I think they call it in ELM, and therefore reduce the scores here.
So what I'm trying to think through is whether it's something about the AI or about the person. So,
Yeah.
for example, signaling theory would like say, well, I don't trust them because they didn't bother to write a profile. It was about the honest signal that I took the time to actually construct something, and not about the existence of the AI itself being the problem.
That's
But
right.
then there's this other possible explanation that it is something about like, oh, I don't trust it because it wasn't vetted or something like this.
That's right.
And I'm trying to piece out which of those mechanisms.
Yeah, there's some signaling aspect like the warranting or the difficulty to fake this up. We've gone the other way, but in fact, I think that that's what's going on here. I think what was going on is it was not the evaluation of the AI, but it was the evaluation of people, because we asked them about the person, right? So it was the evaluation of a person using the AI.
Right.
So
maybe to tease that out, I think what you're making me reflect on is, even if I'm evaluating the person, am I evaluating that they didn't bother to write a profile, so they're not trustworthy, right? It would be like a person on Twitter with just an egg, right? Or is it that because it was generated by an AI, it may be inaccurate, right?
Yeah.
And those are possible. They're both happening.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering which of those is driving this.
So I'm not showing it here. The paper discusses a little bit because we also had an open-ended response for this, and from what we have seen there, it's more of the former, right? So this is the laziness. I don't think that word was used, but the idea of why would, if it's mixed, right? Why would they have to use? This was interesting. I think an interesting finding. For example, here's the AIMC that we see, in fact, recently in the last few weeks. I think Apple launched the fixing of the gaze when you are when you're having a video conference, right? They fix your eyeballs to look at the participant, which will have obvious effect also on the people not using it, because they might seem as less trustworthy, right? Or obvious different evaluation of the people who are actually looking at you when they talk, and not fixed by AI, because people will now think that they're using AI to fix their gaze. So I think this is an interesting question, regardless of how people would think about the artificial intelligence here. So in fact, the fact that the effect only happens when there's a mixed environment, we thought was interesting, and I think is relevant for the other cases as well. So we gave it a name, as you mentioned before. We called it the replicant effect, where in the world that's populated by both droids and humans, even the slight suspicion that something is a droid will cause a significant drop in trustworthiness evaluation. The last thing I don't want to say anything about, but the paper provides a little bit of details, and something we want to do in future studies is there was a strong kind of a folk theory of what is written by AI and what is not, which was a little funny because, as I said, everything was human, and also funny because AI can actually be written to optimize on this classification and make itself seem like it was not written by AI. So, all right. I think there's a very interesting set of questions one can ask in this new world of AIMC. We started with kind of self-presentation and how expectations shift when we have AI mediation in communication, including lasting effect it might have on how we trust each other. But also has interesting questions on language use. For example, how suggested replies or other kinds of tools like that will affect our communication effectiveness. You've probably already seen, all of you have seen how positive the Google Smart replies are, which may shift not only how we correspond using those replies, but our expectations from conversation from everyone else. And also communication outcomes and there's some work coming out from Cornell, Jess Hohenstein and Malte Jung, show that communication blame works differently when we have AI involved in communication. And finally, a lot of interesting policy and ethical questions on where we should disclose or not disclose the use of AI and how we should talk about what it optimizes for. But I want to, in fact, we have a little paper. I just put it on yesterday, so I forgot. AIMC paper is a preprint of an upcoming paper where we provide a lot of what we think are interesting questions going forward in that area. This is with Jeff and Karen. Let me get back to trust so we can have some finishing words. So I've shown, kind of glanced over, but a few different versions of trust and how it happens in our online environments. In one part, I show how partisan tendencies impact our evaluation of content and our shared fact base. And another one, I showed how the AI involvement in content generation brings new challenges in our evaluation of trustworthiness of others online. These trends will continue. We have increasingly partisan content, fake or otherwise, that will push us to increasingly to silos of anger and distrust online. We have, the more exposure that we have to this trend, the more we mistrust, it will just keep escalating. Right? So everything that we see online, we're not going to believe it, we're going to reject it, we're going to make it worse for the next generation of content that we evaluate, all the way to, of course, deep fakes that will undermine any trust we might have in content, text, image, video, interpersonal or otherwise. So when this happens, and we need to think about ways to not let it happen, this happens, it might undermine the trust that we have in each other, the trust that we have in other forms of society that lets us function on a daily basis. In fact, Neil Stephenson's Fall, the recent novel, he imagines a dystopian, but not far-fetched future in which there is a lot of disinformation. And if you read it, in the book, there is a group that pulls a massive hoax that meant to convince the world that Moab was just wiped by a nuclear explosion, Moab in Utah. And the thing, what really happened is that the hoax was set up by people who wanted to cause enough panic for our society to reconsider the basic elements of how our information ecosystem works, or the internet, or the miasma, as it's called in the book, that allowed the hoax to happen. Right? So they do this entire thing to make us reconsider our basic assumptions of the internet. Not a spoiler, by the way. This is in page 200 out of 800 pages of the book. I'm still powering through it. And indeed, there is no easy solution for trust. Trust is, of course, as the HCI people here recognize, a wicked problem, one that has no obvious solution, no stopping condition, and will take multiple stakeholders and for many disciplines to address. Right? So we need the technologists, we need behavior studies, we need education, we need policy, we need media and journalism. In other words, a perfect problem for HCI scholars. Some of the things that we can do is continue to do empirical research, both understanding misinformation, but also how trust is created and hindered and undermined online. The second is to think about new systems and infrastructure that can promote and maintain the trustworthy sources and credible sources. Is in itself an interesting and an important question, right? So how do we identify those, but also how do we promote those? And finally, come up with policies and ethical and regulatory framework that can support these systems to exist, given what we know about trust. I think we still have time for a few questions. I'll leave you with my Twitter handle and a lovely photo of the Cornell Tech campus at night. Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering about the explanation for the first phenomenon, so that when you see a claim that disappoints with your own perspective, you disregard it. And when you look at philosophers who think about disagreement, so why you change your view when somebody disagrees with you, some people say you should do that because after all you have good information, new reasons where you arrived at it based on reasoning that you have two perspectives to access the world, and you don't know what the other person who comes up with the view, what they thought, and you know what their arguments are.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you kind of, if you give people a reason to think that they made a mistake, so if you flag them, you'll say, this newspaper arrived at that argument or that headline because of that reasoning. You know, that drawing attention to that.
Yeah.
You kind of think, hey, perhaps I made a mistake in my chain of reasoning.
Right.
Whether that would change.
Yeah, so great question. So let me maybe rephrase. The question is about whether we can somehow give some provenance to a claim that will help or show how the assumptions are different than mine, and therefore have me reflect on the outcome in a different way. It's obviously hard to do for any consumer application or things that people use on an ongoing basis. So that's one challenge. The second, this builds on such a significant background that is hard to maybe. I'm thinking about the technologies here, right? So it's hard to tweak out for any headline and any claim you might encounter online because it's such embedded in your worldview in so many ways and in your network. So I'm guessing it will be hard to do. It will be interesting to see what the mini version of that might entail and how that will be, but I don't know. If you have ideas, I'll be happy to hear about.
It might also be that you have just the same effect that you point out a mistake in my reasoning down the line, and I just have the same reaction.
It's So, and how far you need to go, right? So, it's possible that you cannot do it. At the end there.
So in the second study, you said a few times that they were actually human-read.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because you're getting it from a real set of Airbnb profiles, like some of them might have been written not by like a neural network, but by someone with like a Python script that lists things in New York or something.
Yeah.
So did you think about that, or like?
So great. So the question is whether the profile that we use could have. It's possible they were written by non-human. Unlikely based on our evaluation. We saw definitely all the profiles we use and everything we drew from, and I don't think that it was likely. What is likely and interesting for future study is to see if people react the same way if we told them not that an AI has written this, but another human has written this for the host, and how that will change. I think that it may have similar effects. Yes. I didn't look this way. But,
In your first study, you asked people to disclose whether they were left-leaning or right-leaning as part of their variable into the study. Was there an equivalent you did for the second study in terms of the participants' attitude to AI itself?
Oh, yeah, great. In the second study, we did, we measured AI attitudes, and we also measured general trust attitudes, so generalized trust measures. And there was definitely, there were two things I can say about this. So think about people's generalized trust tendencies, so how people trust others in society. Controlling for that was the same as controlling for the baseline of how different people believed different profiles and didn't have any effect. The AI-ness or the AI attitude, I don't think had a lot of impact on, if I remember correctly, but I can check, on the actual results of human versus AI trust.
I'm asking this because I feel in my user experience, when I do that Google feature, when I click that, I feel a little guilty that I didn't take the trouble to write it.
Yeah.
So now I know the other side may think that, oh, this guy picked that option because over time people know these are options.
Yeah.
So now if I took that study, if I was a participant on MTurk and I had this sort of conflicting experience on how I'm engaging with AI, it changes, it also impacts my own attitude to AI. Then I become more skeptical than maybe otherwise.
Okay. Well, I think that's whether it's the attitude about AI or the attitude about the person use of AI. I think definitely the Gmail question is fascinating, right? So the more now that I get everybody here probably in this room, you go back today and somebody will reply with great idea, let's do it. You'll be like, wait a second, did they just press the button? And it will cause you to reevaluate to evaluate them in a different light. So I think it's a fascinating question.
All right, let's thank the speaker. He'll be here for a couple of minutes.